Okay, today I am here with my good friend Javi, and we're gonna
What's going on,
discuss.
man?
What's up, man? We're gonna discuss making books. It's always like a big topic, and we're gonna focus on a high time standard. Mostly, we'll use 60G as an example, but this applies to any setting. You just have to identify what we're gonna get to, which is the pillar stuff. So, this is how I think about the game. Um, I don't know. Have you looked over this document, Javi?
Yeah. I went over a little bit. I was gonna let you kind of start
Yeah.
before I got into all my questions. I didn't want to
Sure,
cut
sure,
you off
sure.
a ton.
So basically, the way I think about any setting is I think about what's the general range of books that are viable in that setting. So if I think about 60 Grassy, for instance, right? I've created these four pillars, and I think about it in this way. There's flighted books, so you have like SS books, Pixie books
Mm-hmm.
with DK, boars, dwarfs, um, all that variety, but really flight is that core spell there. You have
Mm-hmm.
flightless books, so you have basically not as much mobility, at least in the start of the game, but you also have more pressure in some ways. Maybe you can take some aerials, some mid range spells like Cog Arrow. You have Sanctuary to help you counter a lot of flight books. You have your rush books that are meant to win the games early to mid. It's not meant to really like prolong the game. Then you have miscellaneous stuff like full books. So it depends on the setting, but like 60G, maybe Lich is a good full book.
Mm-hmm.
And the way I like to think about bookmaking is I like to think about what kind of book is good enough to be able to play against any of these pillars. And what that means it's like it's not necessarily that the book is strong, it's that it has some sort of lines of play, some sort of counterplay against any of these. And one of my and the one book I call solved is actually this first book right here. It's the book with flight. So why is this book solved? Why would I say it's solved? Like why would I even use that? I'm not necessarily
Mm-hmm.
saying that the flighted book I have here is actually better than this flightless book. In fact, I would say in a head-to-head matchup, this flightless book is actually advantaged slightly. So why would I put this as like the S tier top book? Reason is when you look at how this book fares against these other ones. So let's say Rush, right? Because any sort of flightless book is going to be weaker to Rush. People like just kind of take that as fact, but they don't get why that is the case, right? The reason it is because when you look at Rush, you can have a different mixture of these spells, but the core is having good high damage spells with high variance sort of damage like
Mm-hmm.
Ice Bomb, good D towers, and then high mobility. Like people take leap, they take glide, and they take flight. Now, if you're flightless, what are you lacking in the early game?
Right.
You're lacking mobility because you don't have flight in the early game, right? And since you're lacking that mobility, then that rush is just going to be that much more advantaged because they can always get to you. That's why flightless is generally speaking weaker to rush. But if you take a book like this against any of these matches, you know, besides this one, let's say you open with shock shield, you can portal grab a rush player and then, you know, pretty handily beat them. Against miscellaneous
Yeah.
books
So
like
where?
Lich, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. Not to cut you off. Just real quick. Uh, where do you see the? Where do you see? Do any of these books have like a? Because I know Rush, its biggest power spike is like in the beginning of the game, right? And then after that, it kind of falls off. Where do you feel like the early game, end game, and late game starts? Just real quick, like turn 15 or something. And then does like flighted or flightless kind of have the advantage in any of those spots, or is it really just, or is Rush the only book that really has that kind of
Are you talking about versus
element?
Rush or like just the power spikes in
Oh, so
general?
Rush, yeah, just the power spikes for any of these books. So does like is Rush the only one that has that like that element where it's really strong in one part of the game and then it's weaker in another part? Or does the flightless, flighted, and miscellaneous? Well, I guess miscellaneous can really go anywhere.
Yeah, yeah.
So flighted and flightless.
Miscellaneous, as you can see the static ball, you can kind of like put two into together. It's like ideally with,
Yeah.
let's say, Lich, you want to go to late game. You want to have like three Wraiths up. You want to have, maybe Dark Defenses up, have, all these like ways to heal back up. And that's how you would dominate as like Lich. On the flight and flight list, it actually varies depending on your book. The books I like to take, I like to develop them into late game. Because if you take
Okay.
mid game style books, like let's say you take Mega Boulder, for instance, right?
Mhm.
Now you have inherently a more mid game style book. So if you look at the type of books I take, I don't even take Dark Knight typically anymore. The reason I don't is because Dark Knight is actually more of a mid game focused type of minion, right?
Mhm.
So if you're trying to win the game with like chip damage in both these cases with like trolls and SS, right? And then maybe like a myth or dwarf or whatever, then essentially you're playing for late game. And by doing that, you basically you're able to allocate more spells for defensive purposes early to mid game so that you can go late.
Okay.
So that's really the advanced strategy. I think most advanced books follow that same line of thinking. Um, like, even you take some pixie books that just have aerials and no DK, those books, maybe the strongest damage besides the aerials is just drain. So really, they're
Mhm.
just going for
Okay.
that, turn 45, 50 win where you just kind of choke you out. But the more advanced the type of books you're running, I think the more late game you'll go. If you go for like a mid range type of or mid game type of book, you're not gonna have as much guaranteed success in a rated queue, I think, because sometimes you'll just
Mhm.
go up against like a rush book and you might not have as much recovery, right? So that's what it comes back to, like these four pillars when you're making a book. You want to make sure that essentially your book can hold its own against anything you play. And I wrote down here, um, this doesn't mean that like the first book I showed, it doesn't mean that it's like OP. Because a lot of people say like nerf this, nerf that, it can like play against anything. No, it doesn't mean it's overpowered. Doesn't mean like it's gonna be um, always like a
Right.
guaranteed win or anything. All it means is that it can produce a fair matchup. That's all a solve book means, right? So that's what I mean when I say, this book is solved. Now, if you take the flightless book, as I say, it can actually do well against any sort of flightless matchup. This flightless book right here, but you put it up against Rush, it's not gonna do as well, right? And a lot of
Mhm.
people when they create guides like this, they might make like spell tier makers and say like, oh, flight is S tier, swarm is S tier, whatever. But when you're creating books like this, you have to figure out what niche each of these spells go into. So you have to figure out, okay, the portal and SS, right? What's it gonna do
Mhm.
for me? What pillar is it gonna cover? First, you have to identify the pillars, right? But once you do that, you're like,
Right.
okay, this is gonna cover rush. The dwarf, what does it cover? Flightless. The SS, swarm, peg. Assuming you play very well, what does it cover? Flight books, right? You can counter pressure like other SS books. Someone might take SS against you, right?
Mhm.
Miscellaneous, how is it covered? Well, this can go into a myth and it can beat Lich, right? So that covers some full books that might be viable in 60G, right? Um, and you're not gonna have huge weaknesses. Like taking DK, if someone takes Swallowing Pit, now you have a huge weakness matchup, right? Like your DK is just out of the game because
Mhm.
of the book you took. That's why, and like the higher
Yeah.
level you go, the less you use those like one hit KO spells like Dark Knight, the more you
Hmm.
gravitate towards consistency, with like Dwarf, Swarm, SS, these type of things.
Gotcha. Okay. So you really think like the that's why we don't see as much Mega Boulder and like high level 60G gameplay because it's just too it's not consistent enough.
It's not consistent enough to climb like consistently, basically. Yeah, like you're not gonna keep climbing and climbing and climbing. You're gonna have some off games. You're gonna get rushed. You're not gonna win every game. And if that's your goal, if you're trying to just win every game, right? You're just trying to climb up as much as you can. It's better to
Hmm.
use more consistent books. And right now, this is, in my opinion, the number one book, just because it can, deal with all these other pillars. If you didn't have, let's say you nerf some aspects of this book, let's say you nerf Dwarf, let's say you nerf Portal, whatever, what
Hmm.
happens, right? What happens is now you invite, what some people call like rock, paper, scissors or whatever, where the book you take basically changes the outcome of the match a lot and it's less dependent on your skill level, right? And I think that's something we gotta be careful of because it's easy to think like maybe a book is overpowered because it's used a lot, but at the same time, it might just be used a lot because it can deal with all these different pillars, right?
Yeah.
And that's a mentality a lot of people don't really have, um, especially at like maybe the mid level where they're just kind of struggling and they're trying to just win with like mid game spells like Mega Boulder, and they're just trying to like just close out games quickly. They don't want to set up much. It's a problem point
Yeah.
people face. But that's essential, and you can carry the same mentality to any setting. So it can be a Dark Fortress, 10 Alien, um, any map, any time. The same concept applies. You have to identify what pillars are actually viable, right? And from there, you have to create books that can basically face all those pillars. And that's why when we talk about like, there's a meme like Axis of Evil, like Full Seas or whatever, right? So when you bring that up, let's
Yeah.
say let's say you have that in like you play like Seven Nexus or something, right?
Yeah.
You play Seven Nexus or something. It turns out there's no sort of mixed book you can take that would be better than that book. And so when you say like, okay, why don't people play more sets outside of Grassy? That's what we're getting at too, where you have some books that are just so dominant that there's really no room for book exploration. Now, if you have, let's say, this flighted book and this flightless book, you can still run them in tandem. You can run seasons, you can run all sorts of different mixes, right? But let's say the only
Hmm.
viable option on 60G was Lich, and there was like nothing else. Like Lich was just like
Right.
crazy strong for some reason. And then we would see a decrease in book diversity. So this is also something you have to think about when you're balancing the metas and whatnot. You have to think about like, okay, how much diversity do we want, and to what extent do we want to see like skill levels? Because if we come together and we're like, okay, full season doesn't take that much effort, and it's the strongest book you could possibly take on a setting, maybe we should like consider some nerfs and whatnot. But that's like a different
Right.
conversation altogether. I'm just trying to make a general point. Like this same mentality can be applied to any setting when you're making books. Um,
Yeah, I can
and
see how it all ties together with Lich being just so dominant on 60G that it really can fill that category.
yeah,
But as far as the dwarf interaction with the portal, is that really? Do you really feel like that's a super strong late game option that people should be using more? Because I haven't really seen it much.
well, I
To see
think
it on here.
yeah, if you there's some cool interactions, right? So one thing I've seen Seer do it too. Um, you might not see it in like lower to mid level games, but what you could do is you could basically portal in a way, on the map, especially if they're flightless or if you cut off the map with tree, or you've cut off their spacing
Mhm.
or something, you can portal there. And you can put like a storm spirit with a shock shield or a swarm up to block off your portal's entry so that they can't go through your portal without being stunned or something. And then what you could do is you could put this miner, you can upgrade it to have the def charge or something, the one that makes the bomb drop.
Mhm.
And you can put it on 2 or 3x or even 6x if you can get it undead like that. And you could drop a bomb selectively like through that portal such that the miner is still safe. You don't need to sacrifice the miner itself, right?
Mm.
There's a lot of cool interactions you can do with miner and portal.
That's scary.
Yeah, but we haven't seen too much of it just because the high level, I guess, rated scene maybe not be is maybe not as active now.
Yeah.
And it's hard, right? Like people have to grow into that sort of skill level to be able to execute plays like this and think along these lines. But yeah, there's a lot of
So
interesting
how do you?
interactions between these four spells.
Just another question. How do you feel Rush compares to? Because I know you've tiered them all here, but I'm just curious. How do you feel Rush is as far as do you feel like the potential of Rush is as high as the potential of Flighted and Flightless, or is
Well,
this just how they perform in like a ranked ladder
yeah,
queue?
I listed it here. Like this is the best to climb with to the worst. So I think if you're rushing, you can go pretty far, but I think you're gonna lose to like maybe a random one point like let's say you're a 1.8k rush player, right? And you play like
Mm-hmm.
a 1.5k and then you play like a 2k. You might beat a 2k, but you might lose to the 1.5k because a lot of times it might depend on do you get a lucky bomb bounce or
Right.
um, do you get good map gen? Do you get a good first turn advantage? Do you get a good ice ball opener? What type of books
Mm-hmm.
are they running? Right? Are they running a sort of book maybe able to like a double tower, um, so that you can't just glide and pebble shot and then still be safe? You're gonna go to that second tower, then you're gonna maybe be stuck or something. There's a lot of
Right.
variance with Rush. It's a high variance strategy. It's not a consistent strategy, and as you can see, it tends to not even rely on like minions or anything like that, or any sort of setup in terms of controlling parts of the map or minions for like prolonged periods of time. So it really is just, can I have hypermobility and can I output a lot of damage and close the game out quick. And if you can do that, then
Mm-hmm.
you'll be able to take games, but you're also going to lose games. So um,
Yeah. Yeah, a lot of really, really high variance. Okay, I get you.
yeah,
So with the flighted and the flightless books, so let's say I do want to build a book that's more focused on like a late game. Let's say I really want to use minor. What are the best defensive spells to make sure I don't get like destroyed by a rush? Because we all know tree is a good one. Peg probably another good one. But
hmm
what about after that? Because I feel like rush can just break those two down pretty easily.
yeah. The way I like to open with this book in particular, there's really like two ways. One is if I go first, if I see that they're glided, right? So if they're glided, I assume they're flightless or they're rushing. They're one of these two pillars, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I pop my SS turn one. Now, if they're, let's say I don't see any sort of glide on them. In my mind, if I don't see glide on them and I'm first, I'm just like, okay, to not take glide and rush is not smart, which means they are taking glide, or they're not taking rush rather. So in my head, I like to flight prot that
Mm-hmm.
that first turn opener. If I'm not first
Okay.
and they hit me either way, I'll still go in like shock shield, especially if they go aggro on me and they try to rush me with like an ice ball. I'm like, okay, they're rushing me. I'm gonna shock shield. If they hit me again, there's a cool interaction with portal you can do, where you can sync them with portal the following turn, so that even if you're, let's say, 100 HP, like, and they're just recently sunk, then you can tree them that next turn, You still have your shock shield active in conjunction with ice shield, tree, right? You should be able to trap them, maybe BFTP out, go flight prot somewhere, summon a Pegasus as they're trying to like tower out of the tree, or flash out. Maybe get like a double drain off. Maybe go somewhere safely in tower. Um,
Mm-hmm.
that's in the worst case scenario where like you start the game with 100 HP or something and they're first. Um, but that's the line I would take, and I think
Yeah.
fairly consistently you should be able to you should be able to basically get that early sync on them. Now, the reason this book is what I would consider solved and like good against Rush is because you can get that early sync. If, on the other hand, you couldn't get this early sync and you started the game with 100 HP, it doesn't really matter if you go like flight prot somewhere or tree off a corner somewhere. With all the mobility they have, they can probably come and tear you apart. Which is why
Yeah.
I don't classify this book as like solved necessarily, and I classify this one as because this book doesn't have the same uh, basically capabilities against Rush as this one does, as the flighted book,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Okay.
And otherwise, if you just look at these two like in isolation, like Flight and Flightless, I think there's a lot of books that could definitely beat this book out. So, and people like I've seen it a lot. Like a lot of people on Discord, they're like, "Well, this book I made is stronger than your book." So, but that's not what I'm saying. I'm not saying that this is the strongest 60 Grassy book. I'm saying that it has some
Right.
sort of lines against pretty much anything you can throw at it. That doesn't mean the lines are like crazy strong. It just means they're there. It just means you'll be able to play a normal game. You don't have these lopsided games. And so I think there's just a lack of intelligence or education sometimes with people, and like they don't understand what I'm saying, but I'm hoping this video clears it up for them. But
No.
yeah, that's how I would how I'd go about it. That's like if you try to make a book, right? Let's say you really want to use like conductor rod or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
You'd have to say, okay, if I'm going to take some of these spells out, which of these pillars am I going to be weak to? And how can I cover up those weaknesses? And the only way like you can solidly book build at that point is like first of all, start off with like a good comprehensive book, maybe like one of these, and take out a few spells at a time and figure out what
Mm-hmm.
niche each of these spells basically covers, right? So some people might take out Flash for Arcane Bomb, right? Some people might
Mm-hmm.
take out Drain for Bank. Some people might take out Aura for Whisper Bomb. But you need to play enough games to figure out, okay, these can actually be like replacements. And that's how you actually create books. You need to have enough game
Right.
knowledge, and you need to understand what niche each one of these spells falls into. And that's why I don't like spell tier makers either. Like when people just say this spell these spells are S tier, these spells are A tier. I'm like, okay, well, you could say that, but there's a lot more nuance that goes into, what makes a good book, right? Um, because let's say Portal is not necessarily considered S tier by many, at least on high times, but
Right.
it's the only way to really reliably deal with this rush pillar right here. So
And so, yeah, that was actually going to be my next question. Like, let's say I am someone who wants to play with like Conductor Rod or Color Spray or one of these other weird spells that aren't really ranked highly at high times. How would I go about like making my own good book with that? So your answer is to just start with these good like bases, start with a good base, and then just try and find what spell fills that same niche. That actually does make a lot of sense though, because
yeah,
when I was looking at this, like if I were to do, let's say I'm looking at the flightless mix, because I don't know about you, but I've been seeing a lot more people take up flightless. It's been popping
yeah,
up a lot lately.
for sure.
But let's say I want to drop, this actually looks really good. I don't know if I want to drop anything. Let's say
Well,
I want to drop Mech Arrow.
yeah. So you have to ask yourself, what niche does Mech Arrow cover? For
Because
me,
that's a big one. Yeah.
For
Megaro's
me,
huge.
what it covers is, let's say you don't have this mobility, right? You're flightless, and let's say they
Right.
summon a boar turn one, or they go flight prot turn one, and you can't reach them with sanctuary or whatever. Um, or they're doing something turn one where like maybe not turn one, but like one common line is, let's say I know Valar would run this against me. He would mud me or like flash me turn one, then mud me turn two. I would tower out, and even if he tower out with sanctuary, then he would go flight prot somewhere else. Now he has tempo on you, right? And if you detower, you're basically playing him on his terms because he has the prot advantage, right? It's difficult. Like sometimes, yeah, some of these spells are delayed, but you can also face people like with Mudball, and they'll basically bypass the delays by like using spells like that. So Mech Arrow covers that early game niche for me a lot, and it also covers a niche for me for one. Sometimes you just need a 50 damage spell, right? And then two,
Right.
you sometimes when they're like side hiding, you just need to like chip them or something, and it helps with closing the game. So if you were to create a substitute Mech Arrow for something, you have to ask, what spell can I substitute it with that can help me kill early game minions? What spell can I substitute it with that can help me close? What spell can I substitute it with, um, that can do like, let's say 50 damage or so? Now, it could be that you say, well, there is no spell that can do all three of those, right? So maybe what you do instead is you say, okay, since there's no spell that can do all three, I need to take out some other spells. And so I have a strong combination. So let's say you take out Rain of Arrows and Rain of Fire, and instead you put in Glide, right? So that you can get to
Mm-hmm.
that turn one summon, whatever it may be, right?
Mm.
And then let's say you put in another spell like that does 50 to 100 damage, maybe Spear. Let's say you take Spear and you take a Snare. Um, so you take Spear and Snare, or like the Prickly, whatever they renamed it to, and
Yeah.
and let's say when you open the game, if they summon boars early, you might like spear those boars, like while you pop glide or something like that,
Mm-hmm.
right? I made this book because I was convinced that this is the strongest mix you can have with trolls. But if you start taking out spells, you don't just have to take out one spell and replace it with another exact spell. You have to look at them in combination. So some of these spells can fit different niches in combination, and you have to
Mm-hmm.
have enough game knowledge to figure out what that combination looks like, right?
Yeah, and
So
that just comes from just playing more games, right? Getting more experience.
it comes from understanding the game. Like you need to have a deep understanding of different scenarios that pop up throughout the game,
Mm-hmm.
right? And if you don't have that understanding, my recommendation is just to play the books, and then try to, when you do feel like you've mastered these books, try to branch out a little bit, change like one spell and see like what happens. See where your weaknesses are, and then maybe see if you could change out one or two more spells, and then you can kind of see, okay, maybe I can create a more viable book that way.
Right.
But it is a
Okay.
process. It's like a very active thinking process. It's not like, it's not like you can just take out Mech Arrow for like um, any random spell that does like 50 damage and be like, okay, I'm good. No, because you need to figure out like what areas it covers. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, I'm sure there's a lot of trial and error that went into this as well. Because so let's just is there anything you feel like just can't be taken out? Or do you really feel like that's all part of the magic of book building though? Like you can really take out, and I know you did earlier said there was a lot more nuance to book building, but I'm looking at these and like if I wanted to run this, is there anything that would disrupt the core of this
Well,
build
I
in
would
any
I would
way?
start with a core, right? So I would start with a core. Maybe you start with like, um, give me some spells you want to start with.
Okay, so let's just take me for example. Let's say I'm a mid-level player. I love Conductor Rod.
Okay.
Is that going to work in 60 seconds, or do I need to play these meta
What map?
spells? Do I
What
need
map?
to? Okay, let's just say 60G, just to keep it simple.
Okay, 60G. So first we have to ask what niche does Conductor Rod and Cyclops fill? So Cyclops helps with SS when you're going against SS books, possibly,
Mm-hmm.
right? It could be a double-edged sword in some ways, but it can help soak up some of that SS damage that you take. Conductor Rod is more like, okay, um, it can be a good like finisher spell like Mega Boulder. I would put it in that like same category, right?
Mm-hmm.
Probably a little weaker because you need that aerial opening, and also against flighted units. What do you need against flighted units? Conductor Rod sometimes doesn't stick right, does it?
Right, right. It's
Like
pretty
it knocks
ass.
them to the right or something. What about if
Yeah.
you have Ice Shield with Conductor Rod? Does that help?
Hmm.
Right.
That would be really interesting. I've actually never tried that.
Yeah. So what if you like
Might be sick.
what if you ice shield to like let's say they're right and then conductor rod their left? Are they gonna just kind of even if they're flighted, are they gonna be able to take that whole bit of damage, right?
No,
So
that would destroy them.
yeah, so now we have three spells, right? We have potentially ice shield. We don't have to take flight yet, but having flight to ice shield them in the first place helps a lot. Unless your micro
Right.
is so top tier that you can like maybe hop on a swarm, ice shield them, use maybe like a Pegasus to like block off part of the ice shield so only like half of the ice shield is like covering them on the right. Then you get out with your Pegasus and your swarm, and then you're able to conductor rod them without getting flashed. But that's a lot to ask for. So
That's as cool as this to play. Yeah.
realistically, I would just put in flight to keep things simple, right?
Facts. Yeah.
And I would also put in a spell to help me like get out of these ice shields. So I put in Pegasus,
Mm-hmm.
right? So already we're at we have 8 spell slots we have left that we can basically manage.
Mm-hmm. Does
Um
that feel like it's too much already? Like when we think about designing and building a core, how big does that core like how big how many spells to make this one concept work do you get at before you're like, all right, this is never gonna work?
I like keeping it to like 4 or 5 at most, but right now the thing is if these
Okay.
spells can fit other niches, then it's okay.
Oh,
So
okay. That
so
makes sense.
since they
Yeah.
can fill another niche, it's okay. Um but now like we have to think about other things. So one is um how like what's our game plan in general? Are we just gonna want to like
Mm-hmm.
conduct the rod then when we get on top? That's possible, right? But how do we get them to go on top and how do we get them to, not really chill on the sides as much, right? One option we
Mm-hmm.
have is to take an aerial book. So I would take an aerial book and the premise is that they're going to be topside mostly, looking to essentially dig towards us one way or another, right? We're going to be
Mm-hmm.
developing on the bottom side. So we'll be developing on the bottom side and trying to go through it, and trying to win the game that way. And when you think about essentially what your win con might be, I'm thinking one way to do this because you need to be able to move around from the bottom to the top. I would put Portal and
Mm-hmm.
SS into this book. I put Portal and SS into this book. I would even take
Mm-hmm.
Storm Dragon too, and
Oh
potentially
wow,
and
that'd be
potentially
crazy.
and potentially take out the Pegasus. I would take Storm Dragon. Now you're lacking heals, so I'm thinking, well, you're not really going to be in close combat range, anyways. Typically, um, but I think just taking not taking heals is very risky. There's some core spells like
Yeah.
Tree you might also want against like a good rush book. Um, let me see. What else? We might not have room then for some of these aerials like Skyray. Might not have room for
Yeah.
Skyray.
So Would we rather want to do like Rain of Arrows and Rain of Fire? Because those can Rain
Yeah,
of Fire is good for
ra-
minion killing and
it's
sniping.
yeah.
Rain
Those
of Arrows
areas are
for side
good.
hitting.
Exactly. Those areas would be good for basically um, side hiders too. Portal we already have, which could be good for side hiders. Swarm is always like a great spell just to kind of chip away at them at the same
Mm-hmm.
time. Now, if you want to go for something like very like it's kind of hard, very aggro per se. You could take out Swarm, but I kind of like what we have going on here. So
Yeah. So already, what kind of book would you put this in? Like, how would you? What kind of pillar would this fill? Miscellaneous, definitely, or something,
so
right?
yeah, so when we look at the pillars, we have how does this fare against flightless or flighted books? It doesn't have a tower. So this type of book doesn't have a tower, but you can head fake people and not take a tower every now and then.
Mm.
So this book would fall into the like the every now and then type of book you can take. It doesn't have
Okay.
flash either, so we do need some way to get out, which is either going to be a tower or flash,
Mm-hmm.
and I'd prefer it to be a
Yeah. What is more
tower.
utility in 60s? Do you think?
Yeah, so I would actually take like an ice tower with this.
Oh, an ice tower.
The
Okay.
reason I would take ice tower is because I'm going to be chilling on the sides mostly, and I'm not going to be contesting top much. So an ice tower kind of fits
Gotcha.
that role a little better. And then the ice tower is basically going to help us if we get mudded or something and we want to get out of that. Now this doesn't have BFTP either, which means we really have to go to the sides early on and just give up top immediately, right?
Okay.
Although we do have Storm Dragon, which means eventually we could go up top side. BFTPs help you a lot early game, that early to mid game. But if you set up properly, you could play in a way where you don't necessarily need them late game. And that's essentially what
Right.
we'd have to
Okay.
do. We'd have to immediately go to the side, right? Just start setting up there. Um, Frankly, I don't think we can even utilize Swarm well. So I think really we do have to take Tree, and this would be a Swarmless book. This would be a Swarmless, no BFTP book. Go straight to the side, set up Tree, then
Mm-hmm.
from there you could set up like prots and whatnot, chip away with them by zoning off the map with forest seeds, hitting them with rain of arrows, getting them to like maybe side hide potentially, then maybe eventually getting top control of your storm dragon. Now you have to think about closing, right? So
Right.
do we have good closing spells? Well, we have decent rush control with SS portal and tree. We have somewhat decent control against maybe like flightless, but the sides are tricky here. So since the sides are tricky, you might have to take out Storm Dragon, and we have to think about okay, how do we close these games if they go on the sides, right? So really,
Mm-hmm.
I would take out Storm Dragon for Swarm. This makes it very hard though to pull off, where you have to sometimes use your Swarm to, break off the Ice Shield in ways. Um, it's very
Oh,
Bro,
I
tricky.
see what
This
you
type of
mean.
book is very
all this
tricky.
training, all this training just for me to take your rate, bro. It's crazy.
Oh, that's 1v. But like one thing you could do is you could take that out for I guess one option is you could take out tower and flash, and then early on your opener would be to just forest seed the side and then TP instead of trying to like break out with a tower and flash and then go to the side. But you could start off with like
Gotcha.
Peggy, like you could summon a Peggy there, um, and then maybe have like your swarm there, but then you still need to break land, which makes that tricky. Um, Breaking land is very tricky and it's very important. Um, Maybe I would just consider taking flash there potentially. Um, yeah, I think this type of book could work, although it'd be very tricky. In some senses, like I think against
Mm.
like a flight book it could work, flightless it could work, but the lines are not very obvious to most people.
Mm-hmm.
They're not
Right.
very intuitive. So when you play like a book like this, you're gonna have to take different openers entirely. Um,
Yeah, so I
and
guess this
that
is
comes down to game
definitely
knowledge, right? Like you gotta have enough game knowledge to know
exactly.
what your openers have to change up to. Yep.
Yeah, this definitely requires a more skilled player to handle. I would definitely agree. But honestly, getting you to build a high times book like that live was really dope, actually.
Yeah.
Getting to know your mindset and all that. That
Yeah.
was extremely insightful. Not even gonna lie to you, bro.
Yeah, that's
But
the thought process that goes into any setting too. It's like you have to just run it through your head and just use your game knowledge um to figure it all out. But yeah.
yeah, so you really do just mentally place all these spells. And I guess, hmm. So if I were to take that book you gave me, let's just just for fun, how far do you think I'd climb in 60G with it? Like how high
Well,
do you think my rating?
assuming you get the openers down, like you kind of like
Mm-hmm.
have the general gist of the openers, I think you could go to 2K with this book. If you because
Oh, it's interesting.
yeah,
Okay.
I think you could. I think people don't really start exploiting, what you would might call suboptimal books until beyond 2K. I think you could hit 2K with this book.
Mm-hmm.
I think you can hit 2K with a lot of books. Um, there's a lot of room for growth, I think, and people just tend to follow the usual meta lines without thinking too much about the other person's game plan or what they might have changed up or anything like that. Now you will be susceptible here and there, right, to certain type of matchups. Um, but you have to just kind of
Mm-hmm.
play it by the ear and go from there. But I think yeah, you
Yeah.
could go very far with a
Yeah,
book
that
like this.
definitely looks wacky. You definitely get caught off guard by like a scoops or an OA or something. But nah, I actually was really super cool to have you build that just like live like that. But no, honestly, I definitely agree that after you broke it down for me like that, you really can put everything in like these tiers or rather these pillars like flighted, flightless, rush, miscellaneous. Super easy way to start digesting the game and kind of get a quicker way to advance.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah,
especially for a new player like myself.
yeah. I hope you guys I hope you can like take away something from this and like no matter what setting you play, I want people to start thinking about the game a little differently in like a broader sense. And hopefully we can start seeing, cooler books that come out in C play and it's not just like the same book every day, right? Until like some high level player like decides to change it up. Um
Right.
but yeah, man. Thank you for joining me. I think I'm gonna wrap it up now.
Yeah, of course, bro. No, this was super dope. I'm actually glad you brought me on, man. Like
Yeah,
seriously, thank you for that.
yeah.
But yeah, I'll see you later, man. Thank you.
Yep. Take care. See you.